Hey guys, this is Allison from Allykatkreations. How are you? I'm indifferent. Before I begin, please hit that like, share, and subscribe buttons. And if you've gotten anything from my work, a light bulb moment, a connect the dot, an epiphany, any of the sort, please consider supporting my work. It keeps me eating more than once a day. It keeps the bills paid. I still live in New York, trying to move, but I can't do that without help. And I don't get many people that help me out, as I'm not upset with humanity. But people could be better. The Ancient Mysteries of Secret Societies, Part 3. Just to note, I don't know if there's guns or fireworks going off in the distance, but if you hear background noise, we don't know what that is. The most famous of the ancient religious mysteries were the Elusian. I'm not going to say that correctly, am I? Elusian and yeah, no, that's not coming out. Whose rites were celebrated every 5 years in the city of Elusius to honor Ceres, Demeter, Rhea, or Isis, and her daughter Phosphorone, the initiates of the Exclusian Lucinian, I'm going to get it, school were famous throughout Greece for the beauty of their philosophic concepts and the high standards of morality, which they demonstrated in their daily lives. Because of their excellence, these mysteries spread to Rome and Britain, and later the initiations were given in both these countries. The Lucinian Mysteries, named for the community in Attica, where the secret dramas were first presented, are generally believed to have been founded by Eumolpus about 1400 years before the birth of Christ, and through the Platonic system of philosophy, their principles have been preserved to modern times. The rites of Elusius, with their mystic interpretations of nature's most precious secrets, overshadowed the civilizations of their time and gradually absorbed many smaller schools, incorporating into their own system whatever valuable information these lesser institutions possessed. Harkithorn sees in the mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus a metamorphosis of the rites of Isis and Osiris. And there is every reason to believe that the all so-called secret schools of the ancient world were branches from one philosophic tree, which, with its root in heaven and its branches on the earth, is like the spirit of men, an invisible but ever-present cause of the objectified vehicles that give its expression. The mysteries were the channels through which these one philosophic light were disseminated, and their initiates resplended with intellectual and spiritual understanding, were the perfect fruitage of the divine tree, bearing witness before the material world of the recondite source of the all light and truth. The rites of Elusius were divided into what were called the lesser and greater mysteries. According to James Gardner, The lesser mysteries were celebrated in the spring, probably at the time of the vernal equinox, in the town of Argray, and the greater in the fall, the time of the autumn equinox at Elusius or Athens. It is thus supposed that the former were given annually and the later every 5 years. The rituals of the Eleusinians were highly evolved, and to understand them require a deep study of Greek mythology, which they interpret in its stoic light with the aid of their secret keys. The lesser mysteries were dedicated to Phosphorone. In his Lucinian and Bacchic mysteries, Thomas Taylor sums up their purpose as follows. The lesser mysteries were designed by the ancient theologists, their founders, to signify occultly the condition of the unpurified souls invested with earth body and enveloped in a material and physical nature. The legend used in the lesser rites is that of the abduction of the goddess Phosphorone, the daughter of Ceres, by Pluto, the lord of the underworld, or Hades. While Phosphorone is picking flowers in a beautiful meadow, the earth suddenly opens and the gloomy lord of death, riding in a magnificent chariot, emerges from its somber depths and, grasping her in his arms, carries the screaming and struggling goddess to his subterranean palace, where he forces her to become his queen. It is doubtful whether many of the initiates themselves understood the mystic meaning of this allegory, for most of them apparently believed that it referred solely to the succession of the seasons. It is difficult to obtain satisfactory information concerning the mysteries, for the candidate were bound by inviolable oaths never to reveal their inner secrets to the profane. At the beginning of the ceremony of initiation, the candidate stood upon the skins of animals sacrificed for the purpose and vowed that death should seal his lips before he would divulge the sacred truths which were about to be communicated to him. Through indirect channels, however, some of their secrets have been preserved. The teachings given to the neophytes were substantially as follows. The soul of man, often called psyche, and in Elusius, see, I hear it, and it Lucinian Mysteries, symbolized by Phosphorone, is essentially a spiritual thing. It is true. Its true home is in the lighter worlds, where, free from the bondage of material form and material concepts, it is said to be truly alive and self-expressive. The human or physical nature of men, according to this doctrine, is a tomb, a quagmire, a false and impermanent thing, the source of all sorrow and suffering. Plato describes the body as the sepulcher of the soul, and by this he means not only the human form, but also the human nature. The gloom and depression of the lesser mysteries represented the agony of the spiritual soul, unable to express itself because it has accepted the limitations and illusions of the human environment. The crux of the Eleusinian argument was that man is neither better nor wiser after death than during life. If he does not rise above ignorance during his sojourn here, more men goes on death into eternity to wander about forever, making the same mistakes which he made here. If he does not outgrow the desire for material possessions here, he will carry it with him into the invisible world, where, because he can never gratify the desire, he will continue in endless agony. Dante's Inferno is symbolically descriptive of the suffering of those who never freed their spiritual natures from the cravings, habits, viewpoints, and limitations of their Platonic personalities. Those who made no endeavor to improve themselves, whose souls had slept during their physical lives, passed at death into Hades, where, lying in rows, they slept through all eternity as they had slept through life. To the Eleusinian philosophers, birth into the physical world was death in the fullest sense of the word, and the only true birth was that of the spiritual soul of man rising out of the womb of his own fleshly nature. The soul is dead that slumbers, says Longfellow, and in this he strikes the keynote of the Lucinian Mysteries. Just as Narcissus, gazing at himself in the water, the ancients used his mobile element to symbolize the transitory illusionary material universe. Lost his life trying to embrace a reflection, so man gazing into the mirror of nature and accepting as his real self the senseless clay that he sees reflected, loses the opportunity afforded by physical life to unfold his immortal, invisible self. An ancient initiate once said that the living are ruled by the dead. Only those conversant with the Eleusinian concept of life could understand the statement. It's humid in my house. It means that the majority of people are not ruled by their living spirit, but by their senses, hence dead animal personalities. Transmitigation and reincarnation were taught in these mysteries, but in a somewhat unusual manner. It was believed that at midnight, the invisible worlds were closest to the terrestrial sphere, and that the souls coming into material existence slipped in during the midnight hour. For this reason, many of the Eleusinian ceremonies were performed at midnight. Some of those sleeping spirits who had failed to awaken their higher natures during the earth life and who now floated around in the invisible world, surrounded by a darkness of their own making, occasionally slipped through at this hour and assumed the forms of various creatures. The mystics of Elusius also laid stress upon the evil of suicide, explaining that there was a profound mystery concerning this crime of which they could not speak, but warning their disciples that a great sorrow comes to all who take their own lives. This, in substance, constitutes the esoteric doctrine given to the initiates of the lesser mysteries, at the degree dealt largely with the miseries of those who failed to make the best use of their philosophic opportunities. The chambers of initiation were subterranean, and the horrors of Hades were vividly depicted in a complicated ritualistic drama. After passing successfully through the torturous passageways with their trials and dangers, the candidate received the honorary title of Mystes. This meant one who saw through a veil or had a clouded vision. It is also signified that the candidate had been brought up to the veil, which would be torn away in the higher degree. The modern word mystic, as referring to a seeker after truth according to the dictates of the heart, along with the path of faith, is probably derived from this ancient word, for faith is belief in the reality of things unseen or veiled. I'd be classified as one of those. The greater mysteries into which the candidate was admitted only after he had successfully passed through the ordeals of the lesser, and not always then, were sacred to Ceres and the mother of Phosphorone, and represented her as a wandering through the world in quest of her abducted daughter. Ceres carried two torches, intuition and reason, to aid her in the search for her lost child, the soul. At last, she found Phosphorone not far from Elusius, and out of the gratitude taught the people there to cultivate corn, which is sacred to her. She also founded the mysteries. Ceres appeared before Pluto, god of the souls and of the dead, and pleaded with him to allow Phosphorone to return to her home. This the god at first refused to do because Phosphorone had eaten of the pomegranate, the fruit of immortality. At last, however, he compromised and agreed to permit Phosphorone to live in the upper worlds half of the year if she would stay with him in the darkness of Hades for the remaining half. The Greeks believed that Phosphorone was a manifestation of the solar energy, which in the winter months lived under the earth with Pluto, but in the summer returned again with the goddess of productiveness. There is a legend that the flowers loved Proserpine, and that every year when she left for the dark realms of Pluto, the planets and shrubs would die of grief, while the profane and uninitiated had their own opinions on these subjects. The truths of the Greek allegories remain safely concealed by the priests, who alone recognize the sublimity of these great philosophic and religious parables. Thomas Taylor epitomizes, oh my God, that's not going to come out, right? The doctorates of the great mysteries in the following statement. The greater mysteries obscurely intimidated by mystic and splendid visions, the felicity of the soul, both here and hereafter, when purified from the defilement of the material nature and consequently elevated to the realities of the intellectual spiritual vision. Just as the lesser mysteries discuss the prenatal epoch of man, when the consciousness in its 9 days, embryonical months, was descending into the realm of illusion and assuming the veil of unreality, so the greater mysteries discuss the principles of spiritual regeneration and reveal to initiates not only the simplest, but also the most direct and complete method of liberating their higher natures from the bondage of material ignorance. Like Prometheus chained to the top of Mount Cassius, man's higher nature is chained to his inadequate personality. The 9 days of initiation are also symbolic of the 9 spheres through which the human soul descends during the process of assuming a terrestrial form. The secret exercises for spiritual unfoldment given to disciples of the higher degrees are unknown, but there is every reason to believe that they were similar to the Brahmic mysteries, since it is known that the Lucinian ceremonies were closed with the Sanskrit words nax pax. That part of the allegory referring to the 2 6-month periods, during one of which Proserpine must remain with Pluto, while during the other she may revisit the upper world, offers material for deep consideration. It is probable that the Eleusinians realized that the soul left the body during sleep, or at least was made capable of leaving by the special training, which undoubtedly they were in a position to give. Thus, Proserpine would remain as the queen of Pluto's realm during the waking hours, but would ascend to the spiritual worlds during the periods of sleep. The initiate was taught how to intercede with Pluto to permit Proserpine, the initiate soul, to ascend from the darkness of his material nature into the light of understanding. When thus fed and freed from the shackles of clay and crystallized concepts, the initiate was liberated not only for the period of his life, but for all eternity. For never thereafter was he divested of those soul qualities which after death were his vehicles for manifestation and expression in the so-called heaven world. In contrast to the ideas of Hades as a state of darkness below the gods, were said to inhabit the tops of mountains, a well-known example being Mount Olympus, where the 12 deities of the Greek pantheon were said to dwell together. In its initiatory wanderings, the neophyte therefore entered chambers of ever-increasing brilliancy to portray the ascent of the spirit from the lower worlds into the realms of bliss. As the climax of such wanderings, he entered a great vaulted room, in the center of which stood a brilliantly illumined statue of the goddess Ceres. Here, in the presence of the Hierophant and surrounded by priests in magnificent robes, he was instructed in the highest of the secret mysteries of the Elusius. At the conclusion of this ceremony, he was hailed as an epatus, which means one who beheld or seen directly. For this reason, also, initiation was termed autopsy. Again, guys, I fucking suck at pronouncing words and projecting. So just ignore. The epatus was then given certain sacred books, probably written in cipher, together with tablets of stone on which secret instructions were engraved. In the Obelisk in Freemasonry, John A. Weiss describes the officiating personages of the Elusian. You know what I'm talking about because I said it a couple of times properly. Mysteries as consisting of a male and a female hierophant who directed the initiations, a male and a female torchbearer, a male herald, and a male and a female altar attendant. They were also numerous minor officials. He stated that according to the Porphyry, the hierophant represents Plato's demiurgus, or creator of the world, the torchbearer, the sun, the altarman, the moon, the herald, Hermes, or Mercury, and the other official minor stars. From the records available, a number of strange and apparently supernatural phenomena accompanied the rituals. Many initiates claim to have actually seen the living gods themselves. Whether this was the result of religious ecstasy or the actual cooperation of invisible powers with the visible priests must remain a mystery. In the Metamorphosis or Golden Ass, I swear it says ass, Polonius thus describes what in all probability is his initiation into the Lucinian Mysteries. You see, I said it right that time. I approached to the confines of death, and having trod on the threshold of Proserpine, I returned from it, being carried through all the elements. At midnight, I saw the sun shining with a splendid light, and I manifestly drew near to the gods beneath and the gods above, and approximately adored them. Women and children were admitted to the Lucinian Mysteries, and at one time, they were literally thousands of initiates because this vast host was not prepared for the highest spiritual and mystical doctrines. A division necessarily took place within the society itself. The higher teachings were given to only a limited number of initiates who, because of superiority and mentality, showed a comprehensive grasp of their underlying philosophical concepts. Socrates refused to be initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries. For knowing its principles without being a member of the order, he realized that the membership would seal his tongue, that the mysteries of Elusius were based upon great and eternal truths, is attested by the veneration in which they were held by the great minds of the ancient world. M. Hovarth asks, would Pindar Plato, Cicero, Epictetus have spoken of them with such admiration if the Hierophant had satisfied himself with loudly proclaiming his own opinions or those of his order. The garments in which candidates were initiated were preserved for many years and were believed to possess almost sacred properties, just as the soul can have no covering save wisdom and virtue. So the candidates, being as yet without true knowledge, were presented to the mysteries unclothed, being first given the skin of an animal and later a consecrated robe to symbolize the philosophical teaching received by the initiate. During the course of the initiation, the candidate passed through two gates. The first led downward into the lower worlds and symbolized his birth into ignorance. The second led upward into a room brilliantly lighted by unseen lamps, in which was the statue of Ceres, in which symbolized the upper world, or the abode of light and truth. Strabo states that the great temple of Elusius would hold between 20 and 30,000 people. The caves dedicated by Zarathustra also had these two doors, symbolizing the avenues of birth and death. The following paragraph from Porphyry gives a fairly adequate conception of I can't today. I can't. Eleusinium. I'm going to get that in solid in my brain. And you're going to hear fireworks, another reason why I stopped. Symbolism. God being a luminous principle residing in the midst of the most suitable fire, he remains forever invisible to the eyes of those who do not elevate themselves above material life. On this account, the sight of transparent bodies such as crystal, Parian marble, and even ivory recalls the idea of divine light, as the sight of gold excites an idea of purity, for gold cannot be sullied. Some have thought by a black stone would signify the invisibility of the divine essence. To express supreme reason, the divinity was represented under the human form, and beautiful for God is the source of beauty of different ages and in various attitudes, sitting upright, or one or the other sex, as a virgin or a young man, a husband or a bride, that all the shades and graduations might be marked. Everything luminous was subsequently attributed to the gods, the sphere, and all that is spherical, to the universe, to the sun and the moon, sometimes to fortune and to hope, the circle and all circular figures to eternity, to the celestial movements, to the circles and zones of the heavens, the section of circles to the phases of the moon, and the pyramids and obelisks to the ingenious principle, and through that to the gods of heaven. A cone expresses the sun, a cylinder the earth, the phallus a triangle, and symbol of the matrix, designate generation. From Essay on the Mysteries of Elusius by Amroff. The Lucinian Mysteries, according to Heckelthorn, survived all others and did not cease to exist as an institution until nearly 400 years after Christ, when they were finally suppressed by Theodosius, styled the Great. I didn't say that right. Who cruelly destroyed all who would not accept Christian faith. Of this greatest of all philosophical institutions, Cicero said that it taught men not only how to live, but how to die. The Orphic Mysteries. Orpheus, the Thracian bard, the great initiator of the Greeks, ceased to be known as a man and was celebrated as divinity several centuries before the Christian era. As Orpheus himself writes, Thomas Taylor, scarcely a vestige of his life to be found amongst the immense ruins of time. For who has ever been able to affirm anything with certainty of his origin, his age, his country, and condition? This alone may be depended upon from general assent that there formerly lived a person named Orpheus, who was the founder of theology among the Greeks, the institutor of their lives and morals, the first of prophets, and the prince of poets, himself the offspring of a muse, who taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries, and from whose wisdom, from a perennial and abundant foundation, the divine muse of Homer and the sublime theology of Pythagoras and Plato flowed. Orpheus was founder of the Grecian mythological system, which he used as a medium for the promulgation of his philosophical doctrines. The origin of his philosophy is uncertain. He may have got it from the Brahmins, there being legends to the effect that he was a Hindu, his name possibly being derived from the Greek version, which I cannot, Orpheus, meaning dark. Orpheus was initiated into the Egyptian mystery schools, from which he secured extensive knowledge of magic, astrology, sorcery, and medicine. The mysteries of the Cabri at Samothrace were also conferred upon him, and thus undoubtedly contributed to his knowledge of the medicine and music. The romance of Orpheus and Eurodice is one of the tragic episodes of Greek mythology, and apparently constitutes the outstanding feature of the Orphic rite. Eurodice, in her attempted to escape from a villain seeking to seduce her, died from the venom of the poisonous serpent which stung her in the heel. Orpheus, penetrating to the very heart of the underworld, so charmed Plato and Phosphorone with the beauty of his music that they agreed to permit Eurodice to return to life if Orpheus would lead her back to the sphere of the living without once looking round to see if she were following. So great was his fear, however, that she would stray from him, that he turned his head, and Eurodice, with a heartbroken cry, was swept back into the land of death. Orpheus wandered the earth for a whole disconsolate, and there are several conflicting accounts of the manner of his death. Some declared that he was slain by a bolt of lightning, others that he's failing to save his beloved Eurodice, he committed suicide. The generally accepted version of the death, however, is that he was torn to pieces by Ciconian woman whose advances had been spurred. In the 10th book of Plato's Republic, it is declared that because of his sad fate at the hands of a woman, the soul that had once been Orpheus, upon being destined to live again in the physical world, chose rather to return in the body of a swan that he born of a woman. The head of Orpheus, after being torn from his body, was cast with his lyre into the river Hebrus, down which is floated to the sea, where wedging in a cleft in a rock. It gave oracles for many years. The lyre, after being stolen from its shrine and working the destruction of the thief, was picked up by the gods and fashioned into a constellation. Orpheus had long been sung as the patron of music. On his 7-string lyre, he played with perfect harmonies that the gods themselves were moved to acclaim his power. When he touched the strings of an instrument, the birds and beasts gathered about him, and he wandered through the forest. His enchanting melodies caused even the ancient trees with mighty effort to draw their gnarled roots from out of the earth and follow him. Orpheus is one of the many immortals who had sacrificed themselves that mankind might have the wisdom of the gods. By the symbolism of his music, he communicated the divine secrets to humanity, and several authors have declared that the gods, through loving him, feared that he would overthrow their kingdom and therefore reluctantly encompassed his destruction. As time passed on, the historical Orpheus became hopelessly confounded with the doctrine he represented and eventually became the symbol of the Greek school of the ancient wisdom. Thus, Orpheus was declared to be the son of Apollo, the divine and perfect truth, and Calliope, the muse of harmony and rhythm. Again, I don't know if I'm saying that name right. In other words, Orpheus is the secret doctrine Apollo, revealed through music Calliope. Eurodice is humanity dead from the sting of a serpent of false knowledge and imprisoned in the underworld of ignorance. Sounds like we're in that paradigm right now. Hi. In this allegory, Orpheus signifies theology, which wins her from the king of the dead, but fails to accomplish her resurrection because it falsely estimates and mistrusts the innate understanding within the human soul. The Ciconian women who tore Orpheus's limbs from limb symbolize the various contending theological factions which destroy the body of truth. They cannot accomplish this, however, until their discordant cries drown out the harmony drawn by Orpheus from his magic lyre. The head of Orpheus signifies the Stoic doctrines of his cult. These doctrines continue to live and speak even after his body, the cult, has been destroyed. The lyre is the secret teaching of Orpheus. The 7 strings are the 7 divine truths, which are the keys to the universal knowledge. The differing accounts of his death represents the various means used to destroy the secret teachings. Wisdom can die in many ways at the same time. The allegory of Orpheus incarnating in the white swan merely signifies that the spiritual truths he promulgated will continue and will be taught by the illumined initiates of all future ages. The swan is a symbol of the initiates of the mysteries. It is a symbol also of divine power, which is progenitor of the world. Many of you know why I'm looking at the screen so odd. I wonder what the black swan means. The Bacchic and Dionysiac rites. The Bacchic rite centers around the allegory of the youthful Bacchus, Dionysos or Zagreus, being torn to pieces by the Titans. These giants accomplished the destruction of Bacchus by causing him to become fascinated by his own image in a mirror. After dismembering him, the Titans first boiled the pieces in water and afterwards roasted them. Peleus rescued the heart of the murdered god, and by the precaution, Bacchus, Dionysos, was enabled to spring forth again in all his former glory. Jupiter, the demiurgus, beholding the crime of the Titans, hurled his thunderbolts and slew them, burning their bodies to ashes with heavenly fire. Hour of the ashes of the Titans, which are contained a portion of the flesh of Bacchus, whose body they had partly devoured, the human race was created. Thus, the mundane life of every man was said to contain a portion of the Bacchic life. For this reason, the Greek mysteries warned against suicide. He who attempts to destroy himself raises his hand against the nature of Bacchus within him, since man's body is indirectly the tomb of this god, and consequently must be preserved with the greatest care. Bacchus, Dionysos, represents the rational soul of the inferior world. He is the chief of the Titans, the artifactors of the mundane spheres. The Pythagoreans call him the Titanic monad. Thus, Bacchus is the all-inclusive idea of the Titanic sphere, and the Titans, or gods of the fragments, the active agencies by means of which universal substance is fashioned into the pattern of this idea. The Bacchic state signifies the unity of the rational soul in a state of self-knowledge, and the Titanic state the diversity of the rational soul, which, being scattered throughout creation, loses the consciousness of its own essential oneness. The mirror into which Bacchus gazes, and which is the cause of his fall, is the great sea of illusion, the lower world fashioned by the Titans. Bacchus, the mundane rational soul, seeing his image before him, accepts the image as a likeness of himself, and ensouls the likeness, that is, the rational idea ensouls its reflection, the irrational universe. By ensouling the rational image of its implants, in the urge to become like its source, the rational image. Therefore, the ancients said that the man does not know the gods by logic or by reason, but rather by realizing the presence of the gods within himself. After Bacchus gazed into the mirror and followed his own reflection into matter, the rational soul of the world was broken up and distributed by the Titans throughout the mundane sphere of which it is the essential nature, but the heart of the source of it they could not scatter. The Titans took the dismembered body of Bacchus and boiled it in water, symbol of immersion, and in the material universe, which represents the incorporation of Bacchic principle and form. The pieces were afterwards roasted to signify the subsequent ascension of the spiritual nature out of form. When Jupiter, the father of Bacchus and the demiurgus of the universe, saw that the Titans were hopelessly involving the rational or divine idea by scattering its members through the constituent parts of the lower world, he slew the Titans in order that the divine idea might not be entirely lost. From the ashes of the Titans, he formed mankind, whose purpose of existence was to preserve and eventually to release the Bacchic idea, or rational soul, from the Titanic fabrication. Jupiter, being the demiurgus and fabricator of the material universe, is the third person of the creative triad, consequently the Lord of Death. For death exists only in the lower sphere of being over which he presides. Disintegration takes place so that reintegration may follow upon a higher level of form or intelligence. The thunderbolts of Jupiter are emblematic of his disintegrative power. They reveal the purpose of death, which is to rescue the rational soul from the devouring power of the irrational nature. Man is a composite creature. His lower nature consists of fragments of the Titans, and his higher nature, the sacred immortal flesh life of Bacchus. Therefore, man is capable of either a titanic irrational or a Bacchic rational existence. The Titans of Hesiod, who were 12 in number, were probably analogous to the celestial zodiac, whereas the Titans who murdered and dismembered Bacchus represented the zodiacal powers distorted by their involvement in the material world. Thus, Bacchus represents the sun who is dismembered by the signs of the zodiac, and from whose body the universe is formed. When the terrestrial forms were created from the various parts of his body, the senses of wholeness was lost, and the sense of separateness established. The heart of Bacchus, which was saved by Phallus, or Minerva, was lifted out of the four elements symbolized by his dismembered body and placed in the ether. The heart of Bacchus is the immortal center of the rational soul. After the rational soul had been distributed throughout the creation and the nature of man, the Bacchic mysteries were instituted for the purpose of disentangling it from the irrational titanic nature. This disentanglement was the process of lifting the soul out of the state of separateness into that of unity. The various parts and members of Bacchus were collected from the different corners of the earth. When all the rational parts were gathered, Bacchus is resurrected. The rites of Dionysius were very similar to those of Bacchus, and by many these two gods are considered as one. Statue of Dionysius were carried in the Lucinian Mysteries, especially by the lesser degrees. Bacchus, representing the soul of the mundane sphere, was capable of the infinite multiplicity of form and designations. Dionysius apparently was his solar aspect. The Dionysiac architects constituted an ancient secret society in principles and doctrines, which, like the modern Freemasons or the Freemasonic order, they were an organization of builders bound together by their secret knowledge of the relationship between the earthly and divine sciences of architectonics. They were supposedly employed by King Solomon in the building of his temple, although they were not Jews, nor did they worship the God of the Jews, being followers of Bacchus and Dionysius. The Dionysiac architects erected many of the great monuments of antiquity. They possessed a secret language and a system of marking their stones. They had an annual convocations and sacred feasts. The exact nature of their doctrines is unknown. It is believed that the Karim Abif was an initiate of this society. Interesting. I'm going to read this last section. It's a little lengthy, but worth it. Atlantis and the gods of antiquity. Atlantis is the subject of a short but important article appearing in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institute for the year ending June 30th, 1915. The author, M. Pierre Timmer, a member of the Academy of Sciences and Director of Service of the Geologic, Chart of France in 1912, delivered a lecture on the Atlantean hypothesis. Sorry, guys, I cannot project words out of my mouth today. I don't know why. I think they're messing with me upstairs. They don't want me to get this information out. Hypothesis. Before the Institute Oceanographique, French. It is the translated notes of this remarkable lecture that are published in the Smithsonian report. See, they really don't want me to read this. After a long period of disdainful indifference, writes M. Timmer, observe how in the last few years science is returning to the study of Atlantis. How many naturalists, geologists, zoologists, or botanists are asking one another today whether Plato has not transmitted to us, with slight amplification, a page from the actual history of mankind. No affirmation is yet permissible, but it seems more and more evident that a vast region, continental or made up of great islands, has collapsed west of the Pillars of Hercules, otherwise called the Strait of Gibraltar, and that its collapse occurred in not far distant past. In any event, the question of Atlantis is placed anew before men of science. And since I do not believe that it can either be solved without the aid of oceanography, I have thought it natural to discuss it here in this temple of maritime science, and to call to such a problem long scorned, but now being revived, the attention of oceanographers, as well as the attention of those who, through immense in the tumult of cities, lend an ear to the distant murmur of the sea. In his lecture, M. Timmer presents geologic, geographic, and zoologic data in substantiation of the Atlantis theory. Figuratively draining the entire bed of the Atlantic Ocean, he considers the inequities of the basin and cities located on a line from the Azores to Iceland, where dredging has brought lava to the surface for a depth of 3,000 meters. The volcanic nature of the islands now existing in the Atlantic Ocean corroborates Plato's statement that the Atlantean continent was destroyed by a volcanic cataclysms. M. Timmer also advances the conclusions of young French zoologist M. Louis Germain, who admitted that the existence of an Atlantic continent connected with the Iberian Peninsula and with Mauritania. I'm not going to bother pronouncing that properly. Prolonged toward the south, so as to include some regions of desert climate. And Timmer concludes his lecture with a graphic picture of the engulfment of that continent. The description of the Atlantean civilization given by Plato in the Kritas may be summarized as follows. In the first ages, the gods divided the earth among themselves, proportioning it according to their respective dignities. Each became the peculiar, can't get that word out either, deity of his own allotment, and established therein temples to himself, ordained a priestcraft, and instituted a system of sacrifice. To Poseidon was given the sea and the island continent of Atlantis. In the midst of the island was a mountain, which was the dwelling place of 3 earth-born primitive human beings, Evenor, his wife, Lucrece, and their only daughter, Cleito. The maiden was very beautiful, and after the sudden death of her parents, she was wooed by Poseidon, who begat her 5 pairs of male children. Poseidon appointed his continent among these 10, and Atlas, the eldest, he made overlord of the other 9. Poseidon further called the country, Atlantis, and the surrounding sea the Atlantic, in honor of Atlas. Before the birth of his 10 sons, Poseidon divided the continent and the coastwise sea into concentric zones of land and water, which were as perfect as though turned upon a lathe. 2 zones of land and 3 of water surrounded the central island, which Poseidon caused to be irrigated with 2 springs of water, one warm and the other cold. The descendants of Atlas continued as rulers of Atlantis, and with wise government and industry elevated the country to a position of surpassing dignity. The natural resources of Atlantis were apparently limitless. Precious metals were mined, wild animals domesticated, and perfumes distilled from its fragrant flowers. While enjoying the abundance natural to their semi-tropic location, the Atlanteans employed themselves also in the erection of palaces, temples, and docks. They bridged the zones of sea and later dug a deep canal to connect the outer ocean with the central island, where stood the palaces and temple of Poseidon, which excelled all other structures in magnificence. A network of bridges and canals were created by the Atlanteans and united the various parts of their kingdom. Plato then describes the white, black, and red stones which they quarried from beneath their continent and used in the construction of public buildings and docks. They circumscribed each of the land zones with a wall, the outer wall being covered with brass, the middle with tin, and the inner, which encompassed the citadel, with orichalcum. The citadel on the central island contained the palaces, temples, and other buildings. In its center, surrounded by a wall of gold, was a sanctuary dedicated to Calito and Poseidon. Here the first 10 princes of the island were born, and here each year their descendants brought offerings. Poseidon's own temple is exterior entirely covered with silver, and its pinnacles with gold also stood with the citadel. The interior of the temple was ivory, gold, and silver, and orichalcum. I'm not saying that right, guys. Even to the pillars and floor, the temple contained a colossal statue of Poseidon, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. About him 100 Nereids riding on dolphins. Arranged outside the building were golden statues of the first 10 kings and their wives. In the groves and gardens were hot and cold springs. There were numerous temples to various deities, places of exercise for men and for beasts, public baths, and a great race course for horses. At various vantage points on the zones were fortifications, and to the great harbor came vessels from every maritime nation. The zones were so thickly populated that the sound of human voices was ever in the air. That part of Atlantis facing the sea was described so lofty and precipitous, but about the central city was a plain sheltered by mountains renowned for their size, number, and beauty. The plain yielded 2 crops each year, in the winter being watered by rains, in the summer by immense irrigation and canals, which were also used for transportation. The plain was divided into sections, and in time of war, each section supplied its quota of fighting men and chariots. The 10 governments differed from each other in details concerning military requirements. Each of the kings of Atlantis had complete control over his own kingdom, but their mutual relationships were governed by a code engraved by the first 10 kings on a column of orichalcum standing in the temple of Poseidon. At alternate intervals of 5 and 6 years, a pilgrimage was made to this temple that each equal honor might be conferred upon both the odd and the even numbers. Here, with appropriate sacrifice, each king renewed his oath by loyalty upon the sacred inscription. Here also the kings donned azure robes and sat in judgment. At daybreak, they wrote their sentence upon a golden tablet and deposited them with their robes as memorials. The chief laws of the Atlantean kings were that they should not take up arms against each other, and they should come to assistance of any of their number who was attacked. In matters of war, great moment, the final decision was in the hands of the direct descendants of the family of Atlas. No king had the power of life and death over his kinsmen without the assent of a majority of the 10. Plato concludes his description by declaring that it was this great empire which attacked the Hellenic states. This did not occur, however, until their power and glory had lured the Atlantean kings from the pathway of wisdom and virtue. Filled with false ambition, the rulers of Atlantis determined to conquer the entire world. Zeus, perceiving the wickedness of the Atlanteans, gathered the gods into his holy habitation and addressed them. Here, Plato's narrative comes to an abrupt end, for the Critias was never finished. In Timaeus is a further description of Atlantis, supposedly given to Solon by an Egyptian priest, and which concludes as follows. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night, a rain, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth. And the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared and was sunken beneath the sea. And that is the reason why the sea is The sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable because there is such a quality of shallow mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. In the introduction to his translation of the Timaeus, Thomas Taylor quotes from A History of Ethiopia, written by Margilius, which contains the following reference to Atlantis. For they relate that in their time there were 7 islands in the Atlantic Sea, sacred to Proserpine, and besides these, 3 others of immense magnitude, one of which was sacred to Plato, another to Ammon, and another which is in the middle of these and is 1,000 stadia to Neptune. Cranator, commenting upon Plato, assessed that the Egyptian priests declared the story of Atlantis to be written upon pillars which were still preserved circa 300 BC. Ignatius Donnelly, who gave the subject of Atlantis profound study, believed that the horses were first domesticated by the Atlanteans, for which reason they had always been considered peculiarly sacred to Poseidon. Again, guys, I can't get that word out, and it's not going to come out. From a careful consideration of Plato's description of Atlantis, is evident that the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as the story should not be regarded as wholly historical, but rather as both allegorical and historical. Origen, Porphyry, Proclus, Amblicius, and Cyrenius realized that the story concealed a profound philosophical mystery, but they disagreed as to the actual interpretation. Plato's Atlantis symbolizes the threefold nature of both the universe and the human body. The 10 kings of Atlantis are the trajectories or numbers which are born as 5 pairs of opposites. The numbers 1 through 10 rule every creature, and the number in turn are under the control of the monad, or one, the eldest among them. With the trident scepter of Poseidon, these kings held sway over the inhabitants of the 7 small and 3 great islands comprising Atlantis. Philosophically, the 10 islands symbolize the triune powers of the superior deity and the 7 regions who bow before his eternal throne. If Atlantis be considered as the archetypal sphere, then its immersion signifies the descent of rational, organized consciousness into the illusionary, impermanent realm of irrational, mortal ignorance. Both the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical story of the fall of men signifies spiritual involution, a prerequisite to conscious evolution. Either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve 2 widely different ends, or else the accounts preserved by the Egyptian priests were tampered with to perpetuate the secret doctrine. This does not mean to imply that the Atlantis is purely mythological, but it overcomes the most serious obstacle to acceptance of the Atlantis theory, namely the fantastic accounts of its origin, size, appearance, and date of the destruction, 9,600 BC. I have a co-host coming. In the midst of the central island of Atlantis was a lofty mountain which cast a shadow 5,000 stadia in extent, and whose summit touched the sphere of ether. This is the axle mountain of the world, sacred among many races and symbolic of the human head, which rises out of the 4 elements of the body. The sacred mountain, upon whose summit stood the temple of the gods, gave rise to the stories of Olympus, Meru, and Asgard. The city of the Golden Gates, the capital of Atlantis, is one now preserved among numerous religions as the city of the gods, or the holy city. Here is the archetype of the New Jerusalem, with its streets paved with gold and 12 gates shining with precious stones. The history of Atlantis, writes Ignatius Donnelly, is the key of the Greek mythology. There can be no question that these gods of Greece were human beings. The tendency to attach divine attributes to great earthly rulers is one deeply implanted in human nature. The same author sustains his views by noting that the deities of the Greek pantheon were not looked upon as creators of the universe, but rather regents set over it by its more ancient original benefactors. The Garden of Eden, from which humanity was driven by a flaming sword, is perhaps an allusion to the earthly paradise supposedly located west of the Pillars of Hercules and destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. The deluge legend may be traced also to the Atlantean inundation, during which a world was destroyed by water. The religious, philosophic, and scientific knowledge possessed by the priestcrafts of antiquity secured from Atlantis, whose submergence obliterated every vestige of its part in the drama of the world progress. Atlantean sun worship has been perpetuated in the ritualism and ceremonialism of both Christianity and pagandom. Both the cross and the serpent were Atlantean emblems of divine wisdom. The divine Atlantean progenitors of the Mayas and Quiches of Central America coexisted with the green and azure radiance of Glugamas masks. I'm not going to say that right either. The plumed serpent. The 6 skyborn sages came into manifestation as centers of light bound together, were synthesized by the 7th and chief of their order, the feathered snake, Popol Vuh. The title of the wing or plumed snake was applied to Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, the Central American initiate. The center of the Atlantean wisdom religion was presumably a great pyramidal temple standing on the brow of a plateau rising in the midst of the city of the Golden Gates. From here, the initiate priests of the sacred feather went forth carrying the keys of the universal wisdom to the utmost parts of the earth. The mysteries of many nations contain many accounts of gods who came out of the sea. Certain shamans among the American Indians tell of a holy man dressed in bird feathers and wampum who rose out of the blue waters and instructed them in the arts and crafts. Among the legends of the Chaldeans is that of Orpheus, a partly amphibious creature who came out of the sea and taught the savage peoples along the shore to read and write, till the soil, cultivate herbs for healing, study the stars, establish rational forms of government, and become conversant with the sacred mysteries among the Mayans, Quetzalcoatl, the savior god, whom some Christian scholars believe to have been St. Thomas, issued from the waters and after instructing the people in the essentials of civilization, rode out to the sea on a magic raft of serpents to escape the wrath of the fierce god of the fiery mirror, Tezcatlipoca. Lapoca. May it not have been that these demigods of the fabulous age, who Andros-like, came out of the sea were Atlantean priests. All the primitive men remember of the Atlanteans with the glory of their golden ornaments, the transcendency of their wisdom, and the sanctity of their symbols, the cross and the serpent. That they came in ships was soon forgotten, for untutored minds considered even boats as supernatural. Wherever the Atlanteans prosected their erected pyramids and temples patterned after the great sanctuary in the city of the Golden Gates, such is the origin of the pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, and Central America. The mounds in Normandy and Britain, as well as those of the American Indians, are remnants of a similar culture. In the midst of the Atlantean program of the world colonization and conversion, the cataclysms which sank Atlantis began the initiate priests of the sacred feather who promised to come back to their missionary settlements, never returned, and after the lapse of centuries, tradition preserved only a fantastic account of gods who came from a place where the sea is the sea now is. Sorry, guys, I got cat rump in my way. H.P. Blavatsky thus sums up the causes which precipitate the Atlantean disaster. Under the evil insinuations of their demon, the Vetat, the Atlantis race became a nation of wicked magicians. In consequence of this, the war was declared, the story of which would be too long to narrate. Its substance may be found in the disfigured allegories of the race of Cain, the giants, and that of Noah and his righteous family. The conflict came to an end by the submersion of Atlantis, which finds its imitation in the stories of the Babylonian and Messianic flood. The giants and magicians and all flesh died, and every man, all except Ruthus, and Noah, who are substantially identical with the Great Father and the Philingethians in the Popol Vuh, or the sacred book of the Guatemalans, which also tell of his escaping in a large boat. Like the Hindu Noah, Vaisvasvata, from the Atlanteans, the world has received not only the heritage of arts and crafts, philosophies and science, ethics and religions, but also the heritage of hate, strife, and perversion. The Atlanteans instigated the first heritage of hate. Instigated the first war, and has been said that all subsequent wars were fought in fruitless effort to justify the one and right the wrong, which is caused. Before Atlantis sank, its spirituality illumined initiates who realized that their land was doomed before and because it had departed from the path of light, withdrew from the ill-fated continent, carrying with them the sacred and secret doctrine. These Atlanteans established themselves in Egypt, where they became the first divine rulers. Nearly all the great cosmologic myths forming the foundation of the various secret books of the world are based upon the Atlantean mystery rituals. The myth of the dying gods. The myth of Tammuz and Ishtar is one of the earliest examples of the dying god allegory, probably antedating 4000 BC. The imperfect condition of the tablets upon which the legends are inscribed makes it impossible to secure more than a fragmentary account of the Tammuz rites. Being the esoteric god of the sun, Tammuz did not occupy a position among the first deities ventured by the Babylonians, who, for lack of a deeper knowledge, looked upon him as a god of agriculture or vegetation spirit. Originally, he was described as being one of the guardians of the gates of the underworld. Like many other savior gods, he is referred to as a shepherd or the lord of the shepherd's seat. Tammuz occupies the remarkable position of son and husband of Ishtar, the Babylonian and Assyrian mother goddess. Ishtar, to whom the planet Venus was sacred, was the most widely venerated deity of the Babylonian and Assyrian pantheon. She was probably identical with Astaroth, Astrite, and Aphrodite. The story of her descent into the underworld in search presumably for the sacred elixir, which alone could restore Tammuz to life, is the key to the ritual of her mysteries. Tammuz, whose annual festival took place just before the summer solstice, died in midsummer in the ancient month which bore his name and was mourned with elaborate ceremonies. The matter of his death is unknown, but some of the accusations made against Ishtar by Zu-Dubar, Nimrod, would indicate that she indirectly, at least, had contributed to his demise. The resurrection of Tammuz was an occasion of great rejoicing, at which time he was hailed as redeemer of his people. With outspread wings, Ishtar, the daughter of Sin, the moon, sweeps downward to the gates of death, the house of darkness, the dwelling of God Urkala is described as the place of no return. It is without light. The nourishment of those who dwell therein is dust, and their food is mud. Over the bolts on the door of the house of Urkala is scattered dust, and the keepers of the house are covered with feathers like birds. Ishtar demands that the keepers open the gates, declaring that if they do not, she will shatter the door posts and strike the hinges, raise up dead, devours of the living. The guardians of the gates beg her to be patient while they go for the queen of Hades, from whom they secure permission to admit Ishtar, but only in the same manner as all others came to this dreary house. Ishtar thereupon descends through the 7 gates, which lead downwards into the depths of the underworld. At the first gate, the great crown is removed from her head. At the second gate, the earrings from her ears. At the third gate, the necklace from her neck. At the fourth gate, the ornaments from her breasts. At the fifth gate, the girdle from her waist. At the sixth gate, the bracelets from her hands and feet. And at the 7th gate, the covering cloak of her body. Ishtar remonstrates at such successive article of apparel is taken from her, but the guardian tells her that this is experience of all who entered the somber domain of her death. Enraged upon beholding Ishtar, the mistress of Hades inflicts upon her all manners of disease and imprisons her in the underworld. As Ishtar represents the spirit of fertility, her loss prevents the ripening of the crops and the maturing of all life upon the earth. In this respect, the story parallels the legend of Proserpine. The gods, realizing that the loss of Ishtar is disorganizing all nature, sends a messenger to the underworld and demand her release. The mistress of Hades is forced to comply, and the water of life poured over Ishtar. This cured of the infirmities of inflicted on her. She retraces her way upward through the 7 gates, and at each of which she is reinvested with the article of apparel which the guardians had removed. No record exists Ishtar secured the water of life, which would have been wrought the resurrection of Tammuz. The myth of Ishtar symbolizes the descent of the human spirit through the 7 worlds, or spheres of sacred planets, until finally deprived of its spiritual admirance. It incarnates in the physical body, Hades, where the mistress of the body heaps every form of sorrow and misery upon the imprisoned consciousness. The waters of life, the secret doctrine, cure the diseases of ignorance, and the spirit ascending again to its divine source regains the God-given adornments as it passes upward through the rings of the planets. Another mystery ritual among the Babylonians and Assyrians was the Merodach and the dragon. Merodach, the creator of the inferior universe, slays a horrible monster, and out of her body forms the universe. Here is a probable source of the so-called Christian allegory of Saint George and the dragon. The mysteries of Adonis, or Adonai, were celebrated annually in many parts of Egypt, Phoenicia, and Bilbo. The name Adonis, or Adonai, means Lord, and was a designation applied to the sun and later borrowed by the Jews as the esoteric name of their god. Simrina, mother of Adonis, was turned into a tree by the gods, and after a time, the bark burst open and the infant savior issued forth. According to one account, he was liberated by a wild boar which split the wood of the material tree with its tusks. Adonis was born at midnight of the 24th of December, and through his unhappy death of mystery rite was established the wrought the salvation of the people. In the Jewish month of Tammuz, another name for this deity, he was gored to death by a wild boar sent by the god Ares Mars. The Adonimus was a ceremony of laminating the premature death of the murdered god. In Ezekiel 14, it is written that women were weeping for Tammuz, Adonis, at the north gate of the Lord's house in Jerusalem. Sir James George Fraser cites Jerome thus: He tells us that Bethlehem, the traditionary birthplace of the Lord, was shaded by a grove of that still or older Syrian lord Adonis, and that where the infant Jesus had wept, the lover of Venus was wailed. The effigy of a wild boar is said to have been sent over one of the gates of Jerusalem in honor of Adonis and his rites celebrated in the grotto of the Nativity of Bethlehem. Adonis as the gourd or god man is one of the keys to Sir Francis Bacon's use of the wild boar in his cryptic symbolism. Adonis was originally an androgynous deity who represented the solar power, which in the winter was destroyed by the evil principle of cold, the boar. After 3 days, months in the tomb, Adonis rose triumphant on the 25th day of March, amidst the acclamation of his priests and followers. He is risen. Adonis was born out of a myrrh tree, myrrh, the symbol of death, because of his connection with the process of embalming, was one of the gifts brought by the three magi to the manger of Jesus. In the mysteries of Adonis, the neophyte passed through the symbolic death of the god and raised by the priests entered into the blessed state of redemption made possible by the sufferings of Adonis. Nearly all authors believe Adonis to have been originally a vegetation god directly connected with the growth and maturing of flowers and fruits. In support of this viewpoint, they describe the gardens of Adonis, which were small baskets of earth in which seeds were planted and nurtured for a period of 8 days. When those plants prematurely died for lack of sufficient earth, they were considered emblematic of the murder Adonis and were usually cast into the sea with images of the god. In Phlegra, they existed a remarkable school of religious philosophy which centered around the life and untimely fate of another savior god known as Attis, by many considered synonymous with Adonis. This deity was born at midnight on the 24th day of December. Of his death, there were two accounts. One, he was gored to death like Adonis. In the other, he emasculated himself under a pine tree and there died. His body was taken to a cave by the Great Mother, where it remained through the ages without decaying. To the rites of Attis, the modern world is indebted for the symbolism of the Christmas tree. Attis imparted his immortality to the tree beneath which he died, and Sibyl took the tree with her when she moved the body. Attis remained 3 days in the tomb, rose upon a date corresponding with Easter morn, and by this resurrection overcame death for all who were initiated into his mysteries. In the mysteries of the Phrygians, says Julius Firmicus, which are called those of the mother of the gods, every year a pine tree is cut down, and in the inside of the tree, the image of a youth is tied in. In the mysteries of Isis, the trunk of a pine tree is cut, the middle of the trunk is nicely hollowed out, and the idol of Osiris made from those hollow pieces is buried. In the mysteries of Proserpine, a tree cut in is put together into the effigy and formed of the Virgin, and when it has been carried within the city, it is mourned 40 nights, but the 40th night it is burned. The mysteries of Attis include a sacramental meal during which the neophyte ate out of the drum and drank from a cymbal. After being baptized by the blood of a bull, the new initiate was fed entirely on milk to symbolize that he was still a philosophical infant, having been recently been born out of a sphere of materiality. It is there a possible connection between this lacteal diet prescribed by the Attic rite and St. Paul's allusion to the full food for spiritual babes. Sallust gives a key to the esoteric interpretation of the Attic rituals. Sibyl, the Great Mother, signifies the vivifying powers of the universe, and Attis, that aspect of the spiritual intellect which is suspended between the divine and animal spheres. The mother of the gods, loving Attis, gave him a starry hat signifying celestial powers. but Attis, mankind, falling in love with the nymph, symbolic of the lower animal propensities, fortified his divinity and lost his creative powers. It is thus evident that Attis represents the human consciousness and that his mysteries are concerned with the reattainment of the starry hat. The rites of Sabazius was very similar to those of Bacchus, and it is generally believed that the two deities are identical. Bacchus was born at Sabaeus or Sabbath, and these names are frequently assigned to him. The Sabaean mysteries were performed at night, and the ritual included the drawing of a live snake across the breast of the candidate. Clement of Alexandria writes, the token of the Sabaean mysteries to the initiated is the deity gliding over the breast. A golden serpent was a symbol of Sabaeus because this deity represented the annual renovation of the world by the solar power. The Jews borrowed the name Sabbath from these mysteries and adopted it as one of the appellations of their supreme god. During the time of Sabaean mysteries were celebrated in Rome, the cult gained many votaries and later influenced the symbolism of Christianity. The Khabaric mysteries of Samothrace were renowned among the ancients. Sorry, guys, I got hair everywhere. Being next to the I can't with this pronunciation. Oh my gosh, this is so frustrating. Elusian, geez Louise, in public esteem. Eurodice declares that the Samthracians received their doctrines, especially those concerning Mercury, from the Pelagians. Little is known concerning the Khabaric rituals, for they were enshrouded in the profoundest secrecy. Some regarded the Khabaridae as 7 in number and referred to them as the 7 spirits of fire before the throne of Saturn. Others believed the Khabaridae to be the 7 sacred wanderers, later called the planets. While a vast number of deities are associated with the Samothracian mysteries, the ritualistic drama centers around the 4 brothers. The first 3, I am gonna butcher these, Asclerios, Arclerius, whatever, attack and murder the 4th Kashmala. Dionysiodorus, however, identifies Asclerios with Demeter, Acleriosos with Pluto, Arcturisia with Proserpine, and Kashmala with Hermes. Alexander Wilder notes that in Samothracian ritual, Cadmilius is made to include the Theban serpent god Cadmus, the Thoth of Egypt, the Hermes of the Greeks, and the Emeth or Asclepius of the Alexandrians and Phoenicians. Here again is a repetition of the story of Osiris, Bacchus, Adonis, Balder, and Herman Abiff. The worship of Attis and Sibyl was also involved in the Samothracian mysteries. In the rituals of the Khabaridae is to be traced a form of pine tree worship, for the tree sacred to Attis was first trimmed into the form of a cross and then cut down in honor of the murder god whose body was discovered at its foot. If you wish to inspect the orgies of the Corybantes, writes Clement, then know that having killed their 3rd brother, they covered the head of the body with the purple cloth, crowned it, and carried it in unto a point of a spear, buried it under the roots of Olympus. These mysteries are, in short, murders and funerals. This Antinicene father is in his efforts to defame the pagan rites apparently ignores the fact that, like the Cabrinian martyr, Jesus Christ was foully betrayed, tortured, and finally murdered. And the priests of these rites, who are called kings of the sacred rites by those whose business it is to name them, give additional strangeness to the tragic occurrence by forbidding parsley with the roots from being placed on the table, for they think that parsley grew from the corybantic blood that flowed forth, just as the woman in celebrating the Theomesphora abstained from eating the seeds of the pomegranate which had fallen on the ground, from the idea that pomegranates sprang from the drops of the blood of Dionysius. Those corybantes also they call calabric, and ceremony itself they announce as the calabric mysteries. The mysteries of the Calabrini were divided into 3 degrees, the first of which celebrated the death of Kashmala at the hands of 3 brothers, the second the discovery of his mutilated body, the parts of which had been found and gathered after much labor, and the third accompanied by great rejoicing and happiness, his resurrection and consequent salvation of the world. The temple of Cabrini at Samothrace contained a number of curious divinities, many of them misshapen creatures representing the elemental powers of nature, possible the brachyic titans. Children were initiated into the Calabrian cult with the same dignity as adults, and criminals who reached the sanctuary were saved from the pursuit. The Samothracian rites were particularly concerned with navigation. The Dioscuri, Castor, and Pollux, or the gods of navigation, being among those perpetuated by members of that cult. The Argonautic expedition, listening to the advice of Orpheus, stopped at the island of Samothrace for the purpose of having its members initiated in the Calabric rites. Eurodice relates that when Cambrys entered the temple of Cabri, he was unable to restrain his mirth at seeing before him the figure of a man standing upright and facing the man. The figures of a woman standing on her head. Had Cambrisi between acquainted with the principles of the divine astronomy, he would have realized that he was then in the presence of the key to the universal equilibrium. I ask, says Voltaire, who were these hierophants, these sacred Freemasons who celebrated their ancient mysteries of Samothracia, and whence came they and their gods Cabrini? Clement speaks of the mysteries of Cabrini as the sacred mystery of a brother slain by his brethren, and the Cabrinic death was one of the secret symbols of antiquity. Thus, the allegory of the self murdered by the not self is perpetuated through the religious mysticism of all peoples. The philosophic death and the philosophic resurrection are the lesser and the greater mysteries, respectively. A curious aspect of the dying god myth is that of the hanged man. The most important example of this peculiar conception is found in the Odinic rituals, where Odin hangs himself for 9 nights from the branches of the world tree, and upon the same occasion also pierces his own side with the sacred spear. As the result of his great sacrifice, Odin, while suspended over the depths of the Nephilim, discovered by meditation the runes or alphabets by which later the records of his people were preserved. Because of this remarkable experience, Odin is sometimes shown seated on a gallows tree, and he became the patron deity of all who died by the noose. Esoterically, the hangman is the human spirit which is suspended from heaven by a single thread. Wisdom, not death, is the reward for his voluntary sacrifice, during which the human soul suspended above the world illusion and meditating upon its unreality is rewarded by the achievement of self-realization. From the consideration of all these ancient and secret rituals, it becomes evident that the mystery of the dying god was universal among the illumined and venerated colleges of the secret teachings. This mystery has been perpetuated in Christianity in the crucifixion and death of the God-man Jesus, the Christ. The secret import of This worldly tragedy and the universal martyr must be rediscovered if Christianity is to reach the heights obtained by the pagans in the days of their philosophic supremacy. The myth of the dying God is the key to both universal and individual redemption and regeneration, and those who do not comprehend the true nature of this supreme allegory are not privileged to consider themselves either wise or truly religious. I'm going to leave it there. But next time, the life and writings of Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus. So I hope all of you enjoyed. Sorry for all the lots of pausing. There's a lot of noise that kept perpetually happening, louder and louder. Also, again, I have projection of words and pronunciation issues. So I thank you for bearing with me. I hate sounding stupid and I hate feeling frustrated that I can't project certain words out that I know how to pronounce. It just doesn't come out properly. So with that, sending each and every one of you love and light. Please hit that like button. Please consider supporting my work. And I'll hope to see you on the next one. Bye, guys.